Imagine standing in the heart of a medieval town square, cobblestones slick from the morning rain, as the church bell tolls overhead. A crowd gathers, murmuring with anticipation, eyes fixed on a makeshift wooden stage. Today, justice will be served. Or at least, that is what the authorities claim. But in this world, justice is not always what we recognize today. In the Middle Ages, the courtroom was not a quiet hall of reasoned debate, but a stage for theater, fear, faith, and spectacle. Truth was sought not through evidence and witnesses, but through fire, water, combat, or even the judgment of God himself. To understand the strangeness of medieval trials, one must first grasp the foundations of medieval thought. Religion and law were inseparable, and crime was often seen as a sin against God rather than simply an offense against society. To commit theft was not merely to rob your neighbor, but to offend divine order. To question authority was to question God's will. Justice was, therefore, not only about punishing wrongdoers, but about restoring cosmic balance. That belief opened the door to some of the strangest cases in human history. Medieval courts were diverse and complex. Kings and nobles held their own courts, where feudal disputes were resolved with oaths, duels, or symbolic gestures. The Church ran its vast network of ecclesiastical courts, where sins, heresies, and blasphemies were judged. Local village courts, meanwhile, dealt with everyday disputes, arguments over land boundaries, stolen chickens, or insults thrown at neighbors. But whether large or small, all courts shared one quality. They were public performances. Trials were not hidden behind closed doors, but staged in front of communities, where justice was seen, smelled, and felt by all. And strange they were. Consider trial by ordeal, where an accused might plunge their hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If the burn healed cleanly, God had shown innocence. If it festered, guilt was proven. Or the infamous ordeal of water, where accused witches were bound and thrown into rivers. To float meant guilt, to sink meant innocence, though drowning was often the price of vindication. To the medieval mind, this was not cruelty, but the hand of God revealing truth. Even stranger, animals could be tried in court. A pig accused of killing a child might be dressed in human clothing, provided with a lawyer, and sentenced to hanging before a jeering crowd. Rats, locusts, and even snails were summoned before judges for crimes of crop destruction. Absurd though it may seem, these trials reflected a belief that law was universal, binding not only men and women, but all of creation under divine order. The bizarre did not end there. At times, the dead themselves stood trial, dragged from their graves to face posthumous judgment. Nobles and kings staged elaborate trials to humiliate rivals, while ordinary villagers endured shaming punishments like wearing iron masks or being locked in stocks. Witchcraft trials blended paranoia with political convenience, condemning people on the flimsiest of evidence, visions, gossip, or strange birthmarks. And then there were the duels, where disputes were settled not by words, but by blades and brute strength, the winner declared righteous by divine decree. These trials were not simply about law, they were about power. They reinforced hierarchies, demonstrated the authority of rulers, and reminded the masses that their lives and fates rested in the hands of both earthly lords and heavenly judgment. For many, trials were less about truth than about spectacle. To watch a man plunge into boiling water or see a pig hanged was to witness justice dramatized, morality made visible. For us today, these cases often feel absurd, cruel, or even comical. But to the men and women of the Middle Ages, they were deadly serious. Justice was theater, but theater with life and death stakes. As we delve deeper into this world, we will encounter trials that seem more like parables or nightmares than reality. Trials that tested faith, mocked reason, and sometimes revealed more about fear than about guilt. And so our journey begins, stepping into the medieval courtroom, where truth was slippery, law was spectacle, and justice could be as strange as a dream. From ordeals by fire and water to trials of animals, corpses, and witches, we will uncover the bizarre cases that defined an age when God, fear, and imagination ruled the law. In the medieval imagination, when human judges faltered, God would reveal the truth. Nowhere was this belief more vividly displayed than in the practice of the ordeal. Ritualized tests of fire, water, or pain, designed not to weigh evidence, but to call down divine intervention. To us, these ordeals seem cruel and absurd, but to a society steeped in faith, they were solemn acts of justice, a way of letting heaven speak where men could not. One of the most common was the ordeal by hot iron. An accused person might be commanded to carry a glowing bar of iron across a set number of paces, or plunge their hand into boiling water to retrieve an object from the depths. Afterward, the wounds were bound and inspected days later. If they healed cleanly, without festering, the accused was declared innocent. If they blistered and blackened, guilt was proclaimed. To medieval minds, infection was not the work of bacteria, but a sign of sin revealed by divine will. There was also the ordeal by cold water, especially notorious in witchcraft accusations. The accused, often bound hand and foot, was cast into a river or pond. To float was to be rejected by the pure element of water, a sure sign of guilt. To sink meant innocence, but the tragic irony was that many innocent souls drowned before anyone could haul them up. Villagers might gather along riverbanks, breathless as bodies thrashed in the current, believing they were witnessing God's judgment in real time. Some ordeals took on a more symbolic character. In the ordeal of the cross, both accuser and accused would stand before a cross with their arms outstretched, imitating Christ. Whoever lowered their arms first was judged the liar. Endurance became the measure of truth. There was also the ordeal of the morsel, where the accused swallowed consecrated bread or cheese. Choking was seen as a sign of guilt, while smooth swallowing marked innocence. Even eating could become a sacred test of character. These ordeals were not barbaric improvisations. They were highly ritualized, often conducted by priests who blessed the fire or water before the test. The Church's role gave them legitimacy, turning each ordeal into a solemn ceremony. In some cases, elaborate prayers and fasts preceded the act, as though the entire community were preparing to invite God into the courtroom. For villagers who lived by faith, there was nothing absurd in asking heaven to decide where human words failed. Of course, outcomes could be manipulated. Priests or lords might favor one side, cooling the water slightly or ensuring the iron cooled before it was carried. In other cases, healers treated wounds to ensure clean recovery. The appearance of divine judgment could mask very human hands guiding the result. Still, for most participants, the ordeal was terrifyingly real. A moment when life, reputation, and salvation hung in the balance. Some ordeals became infamous. Chronicles tell of nobles proving loyalty to kings by walking barefoot across burning plowshares, of peasants tested with boiling oil, of women accused of theft forced to plunge hands into scalding cauldrons. Each tale reminds us how powerfully faith could shape law. Pain was not cruelty, but revelation, suffering not meaningless, but purposeful. To endure without harm was proof of divine favor. To falter was to expose sin. By the 13th century, the Church began to retreat from these practices, especially after the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. Rational inquiry and evolving legal systems slowly replaced fire and water with testimony and evidence, yet for centuries before, ordeals had been the heartbeat of medieval justice, terrifying, theatrical, and deeply symbolic. To us, they stand as shocking reminders of how different the medieval world was, how faith and law intertwined to produce rituals that blurred the line between religion and punishment. To those who lived them, ordeals were deadly serious, moments when God's will was expected to blaze forth in the wound of a hand, the weight of a body in water, or the breath that choked on a piece of bread. Of all the spectacles staged in medieval courts, none are more bewildering to modern eyes than the trials of animals. Yet for centuries across Europe, pigs, cows, horses, goats, even insects and rats were summoned before judges, charged with crimes, and punished as though they were human beings. These trials were not mere curiosities, but serious proceedings, conducted with the solemnity of law. To the medieval mind, every creature was part of God's order, and thus every creature could be judged under His law. The most notorious cases involved pigs. In villages where pigs roamed freely, accidents and attacks were common, and when a pig injured or killed a child, outrage demanded justice. Chronicles tell of pigs dressed in human clothing, sometimes even in little breeches and jackets, hauled into courtrooms or marketplaces to stand trial. They were assigned lawyers, evidence was presented, and verdicts declared. If found guilty, the pigs were executed publicly, often hanged by the neck like criminals. These grim spectacles were meant to restore order, reassure grieving families, and remind communities that no creature was beyond the reach of justice. But pigs were not alone in facing judgment. Oxen, horses, and dogs were also tried for violence against humans. In one French case, a bull that gored a man was executed alongside the pig that had bitten the same victim. Sometimes, animals were punished collectively, entire herds or flocks condemned for trampling crops or attacking villagers. For medieval courts, the act itself mattered less than the symbolic restoration of order. Punishment demonstrated that wrongdoing, even by animals, would not go unchecked. Even stranger were the trials of insects and vermin. Rats, locusts, caterpillars, and weevils were summoned to court for destroying crops. Priests and lawyers argued on behalf of farmers and on behalf of the pests. Summons were issued, sometimes read aloud at the edge of fields, commanding rats to appear in court under threat of excommunication. Of course, the rats never arrived, but their absence did not end proceedings. Instead, elaborate judgments were issued, declaring pests exiled from fields and vineyards, sometimes even granting them alternative, safe spaces to live, patches of land set aside for their use. As though they too had rights under the law. The absurdity of these cases concealed deeper truths about the medieval worldview. Law was universal, binding not only men and women, but also the creatures of God's creation. To ignore an animal's crime would be to invite chaos, to allow disorder to fester unchecked. By punishing animals, communities reaffirmed the authority of divine and human justice alike. These trials also had theatrical power. They gave villagers a sense of control in a world where fate and nature often seemed arbitrary and cruel. Some cases bordered on the comical. Lawyers defending rats might argue that their clients could not safely attend court because cats lurked along the roads, threatening them with ambush. Judges sometimes postponed proceedings out of fairness, recognizing the danger. To us, these legal arguments sound like satire, but to medieval communities, they carried symbolic weight. The law was seen to be impartial, even when the accused were vermin. Yet animal trials could also reveal social tensions. When noblemen's hunting dogs mauled peasants, were the animals punished or protected by their masters? When pigs owned by the wealthy damaged crops, were they treated with the same severity as those owned by villagers? Justice was not always blind, even when animals stood accused. The trials reflected not only beliefs about divine order, but also the inequalities of medieval society. By the 16th century, animal trials began to fade, mocked by emerging humanist thinkers as relics of superstition. But for centuries before, they were a grimly serious part of medieval life. To hang a pig, exile rats, or excommunicate locusts was, in the eyes of villagers, to uphold the fragile balance of their world. To us, they seem grotesque and surreal, but they reveal a society where law was performance, justice was theater, and every creature, beast or human, was bound in the same web of order. The Middle Ages believed that the universe itself was a courtroom, and in that court, no being, however humble, escaped judgment. Of all the strange trials in the Middle Ages, none is more grotesque or unforgettable than the Cadaver Synod of 897 AD. It was a spectacle so surreal that even medieval chroniclers, accustomed to bizarre rituals, recorded it with horror. Here, justice was not only twisted into political theater, it was performed upon a corpse, dragged from the grave and made to answer charges it could never refute. The story begins with Pope Formosus, a man whose papacy was marked by political turbulence. He had navigated alliances and rivalries in a fractured Italy, crowning kings and angering nobles. When he died in 896, his body was laid to rest in St. Peter's Basilica, his troubles seemingly over. But in Rome, power was never buried for long. His successor, Pope Stephen VI, sought to erase Formosus's influence, to destroy his legacy and assert dominance in a divided church. And so he ordered a trial, not of the living, but of the dead. Months after his death, Formosus's corpse was exhumed. The stench of decay clung to its remains as it was dressed once more in papal vestments, robes, gloves, and the ring of office. Propped upon a throne in the Lateran Basilica, the dead pope sat in grim parody of life, his hollow eyes staring into the court. A deacon was appointed to act as his defense, though no words could truly speak for the corpse that slumped before them. The trial of the dead had begun. The charges were political, cloaked in the language of canon law. Formosus was accused of violating church statutes, of illegitimately ascending to the papacy, of conspiring with rival factions. These were not crimes of the soul, but of power, aimed at erasing his decisions and undoing his acts. Witnesses were called, questions asked, verdicts proclaimed, all directed at a body that could neither respond nor resist. The absurdity was breathtaking, but the atmosphere was anything but comic. For the participants, this was deadly serious, a performance meant to terrify and intimidate. When the verdict was read, the corpse was found guilty. The consequences were grotesque. The papal garments were ripped from its body. The 3 fingers used in blessings were cut off, symbolically stripping him of holy authority. Finally, the body was dragged through the streets of Rome and hurled into the Tiber River, as though even in death he was to be erased from memory. It was justice turned into desecration, law twisted into vengeance. But the story did not end there. The people of Rome recoiled in horror at the spectacle. Many saw it as sacrilege, an offense not against Formosus, but against the dignity of the papacy itself. Soon after, Pope Stephen VI was overthrown and strangled in prison, his reign consumed by the fury he had unleashed. In time, Formosis's body was recovered from the river and reburied with honor, his acts restored by later popes. The cadaver synod stood as a cautionary tale, remembered as one of the darkest episodes of papal history. The trial reveals the strange and dangerous power of medieval courts. Law was not about truth or justice, but about dominance, theater, and spectacle. To put a corpse on trial was to send a message to the living that no one, not even the dead, was safe from the reach of politics. It was a grotesque performance designed to humiliate enemies and terrify allies. And in that sense, it worked. For though Stephen fell, the memory of the cadaver synod haunted the papacy for centuries. To modern eyes, the cadaver synod is almost unthinkable, a grotesque parody of justice, a horror fit for nightmares. Yet to the medieval world, it was not mere madness. It was law weaponized, ritualized, and performed with the gravity of religion. It was the stage where politics and faith intertwined, turning a courtroom into a theater of the macabre. In the twilight of medieval Europe, whispers carried more weight than evidence, and a single accusation could spiral into doom. Few trials better reveal the mixture of fear, imagination, and desperation in medieval justice than those involving witchcraft. To the people of the time, witches were not just eccentric outcasts. They were thought to be allies of the devil, manipulators of storms, bringers of plague, and seducers of the faithful. In such a world, the courtroom became a battlefield between Christendom and the forces of darkness. Unlike ordinary crimes, witchcraft could be proven by signs invisible to most eyes: a withered cow, a sudden storm, a child falling ill. Any calamity might be laid at the feet of a suspected witch. Neighbors who quarreled could quickly become accusers. Midwives, healers, or women who lived alone often found themselves most vulnerable. Their knowledge of herbs and medicine twisted into evidence of secret pacts with demons. The village, hungry for explanations, found witches everywhere. The trials themselves were steeped in superstition. Judges and inquisitors looked for the devil's mark, a spot on the body that, when pricked with a needle, did not bleed or cause pain. Birthmarks, moles, even scars could be transformed into damning proof. Confessions were prized above all, but these were often wrung out through torture, the rack, thumbscrews, or sleep deprivation. Exhausted, broken, accused witches confessed to impossible deeds, flying through the night, feasting with demons, brewing potions of bones and blood. Their words, though clearly forced, were taken as sacred truth. One of the most infamous tools of witch trials was the ordeal by water, already practiced in earlier centuries. The accused, bound hand and foot, was cast into a river or pond. If she floated, it was said that the pure element of water rejected her corrupted body, proving guilt. If she sank, she was innocent, but often drowned before anyone could intervene. Villagers gathered to watch, believing they were witnessing a direct verdict from God. In reality, it was terror dressed as ritual. But witch trials were not only about superstition, they were also about power. In times of famine, plague, or war, communities sought scapegoats. The Church, threatened by heresy, framed witchcraft as rebellion against divine order. Nobles used accusations to eliminate rivals, seize property, or crush dissent. Each trial, no matter how small, reinforced authority. To hunt witches was to demonstrate vigilance against the devil's schemes. The testimonies recorded in these trials are chilling. Women described attending Sabbaths where demons led dances under the moon. Men claimed witches poisoned wells or cursed soldiers. Entire communities convinced themselves of impossible crimes, their fears given shape by the spectacle of the courtroom. Even when no physical evidence existed, The power of belief was enough to condemn. One case in 14th century Switzerland tells of a woman accused after her neighbor's cows stopped producing milk. Under torture, she confessed to making a pact with the devil and flying on a broomstick to secret gatherings. Her confession matched the fears of her time, though it was impossible in reality. She was executed, not for what she had done, but for embodying the village's terror. Countless others shared her fate. Although the height of witch persecutions came later, in the 16th and 17th centuries, the seeds were planted in the medieval era. Manuals like the Canon Episcopi condemned certain practices as illusions, while later texts began to insist such illusions were real, feeding paranoia. By the late Middle Ages, witchcraft trials had become more elaborate, their punishments harsher, their accusations broader. What began as isolated cases grew into waves of hysteria. To us, these trials appear cruel and irrational. Yet to medieval people, they made a terrifying kind of sense. In a world racked by disease, war, and hunger, unseen forces seemed to shape every misfortune. By putting witches on trial, communities sought control, a way to make sense of chaos. The courtroom became a stage where fear was given form, where justice and superstition were indistinguishable. The witch trials remind us that medieval justice was never only about crime. It was about belief, order, and fear. For those accused, it was a nightmare without escape. For those watching, it was both reassurance and warning. And for history, it remains one of the darkest shadows cast by the courts of the Middle Ages. In the spring of 1431, in a cold stone hall in Rouen, France, a 19-year-old peasant girl stood accused before a panel of learned clerics. Her crime was not theft, not murder, not treason in the ordinary sense, but something far more dangerous to the men who judged her. She claimed that God himself had spoken to her. This girl was Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, and her trial would become one of the most infamous spectacles of the Middle Ages. Joan's rise was nothing short of miraculous. A shepherd's daughter from Domremy, she claimed to hear voices, saints who urged her to drive the English from France and see Charles VII crowned king. Against all odds, she convinced nobles, soldiers, and even the Dauphin himself. In 1429, clad in armor, she led French troops to victory at Orleans, shattering English momentum in the 100 Years' War. To the French, she was a saint in the making. To the English, she was a witch, a heretic, a dangerous symbol that had to be destroyed. Captured in battle in 1430, Joan was sold to the English and delivered to their allies in the Church. Her trial was never meant to discover truth. It was designed to break her spirit, discredit her mission, and erase her influence. Presided over by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, loyal to the English cause, the trial unfolded like a trap, every question a snare, every accusation a weapon. Joan was charged with heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing. To her judges, the voices of saints she heard were not divine, but demonic whispers. Her wearing of men's clothing, armor, and tunics was framed as a crime against nature. Her victories were twisted into proof of sorcery. Yet through it all, Joan astounded her inquisitors. Illiterate and untrained in theology, she spoke with clarity, wit, and defiance. When asked if she was in God's grace, a question meant to condemn her no matter how she answered, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may He keep me there." Even her enemies admitted the brilliance of her words. But the court was never fair. Sessions dragged on, questions repeated endlessly, hoping exhaustion would break her resolve. Threats of torture hung over her. They accused her of pride, of disobedience, of false visions. Yet Joan refused to deny the voices she heard. She insisted that Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret had guided her mission. Her steadfastness was both her strength and her undoing. At last, the judges found her guilty of heresy. In May 1431, she was sentenced to death by burning. On the morning of her execution, she was led to the marketplace of Rouen. A towering pyre awaited her. She asked for a cross, and one was brought to her, which she held tightly as the flames rose. Witnesses said she called out the name of Jesus again and again until the smoke consumed her voice. The crowd, including hardened soldiers, wept openly. Even some of her English captors felt shame, for they had destroyed not a witch, but a girl who had believed with terrifying conviction. But the story did not end in fire. 25 years later, Joan's trial was retried by the Church, and she was declared innocent, a martyr wrongly condemned. In 1920, centuries after her death, she was canonized as a saint. Her trial, once a weapon of destruction, became a monument to her courage, exposing the corruption of her judges and the political machinery of medieval courts. The trial of Joan of Arc remains one of the most powerful examples of how medieval justice could be twisted by fear and ambition. It was not truth they sought, but control. And yet, in trying to silence her, Joan's judges ensured her immortality. She became not merely a soldier of France, but a saint of history, her voice echoing far beyond the courtroom that condemned her. In the Middle Ages, when nobles stood trial, it was rarely in a humble village court or before a jury of peers. Their trials were public theater, infused with ritual, politics, and often thinly veiled threats. Unlike peasants, who could be whipped, fined, or executed with little ceremony, nobles carried status and lineage that demanded elaborate proceedings. When lords and ladies were accused, the law became a stage for power struggles, vengeance, and symbolic humiliation. One of the most striking features of noble trials was their public nature. Kings and princes used them to send messages, reminding their subjects who held authority. These trials often took place in castles, palaces, or great halls, with banners unfurled and witnesses summoned from across the land. The more powerful the accused, the more grand the setting. Justice was to be seen, not merely done. The nobility, after all, could not be punished quietly. Their downfall had to be a spectacle that reverberated through court and countryside alike. Charges against nobles varied widely. Some were accused of treason, conspiring with rival lords or foreign powers. Others were charged with heresy, particularly when their influence threatened the Church. Still others faced accusations of adultery, sorcery, or betrayal of feudal oaths. Behind each charge, however, lay a deeper struggle. The trial was less about the specific crime and more about weakening rivals, consolidating power, or appeasing public outrage. Take, for example, the fate of Pierre de la Brosse, chamberlain to King Philip III of France. Once a trusted advisor, he was accused of treason after the death of the king's young wife. The evidence was dubious, but political enemies seized the moment. In 1278, he was brought to trial before the royal court. His guilt was less important than the message. No servant, however close to the throne, was untouchable. He was hanged in Paris, his death staged as a warning to all who might overreach their influence. Symbolism played a vital role in noble trials. A traitor knight might have his spurs struck off and his sword broken, stripping him of chivalric honor before punishment. Nobles could be paraded in shame, their coats of arms defaced, their titles revoked. In some cases, executions were carried out with elaborate ceremony, heads displayed on city gates, bodies quartered and sent across the realm. Justice was never only about punishment, it was about erasing honor, rewriting legacy, and stamping authority into memory. Yet not all noble trials ended in blood. Some were resolved through elaborate rituals of penance. A noble might appear barefoot, dressed in rags, begging forgiveness before a king or bishop. Others were exiled, stripped of lands and wealth, but spared their lives. These outcomes often depended less on the crime and more on the shifting tides of politics. If reconciliation served the interests of the powerful, mercy was possible. If destruction was needed, even the highest born could fall. Women of noble birth, too, found themselves on trial, though their cases were often tangled in gendered expectations. Adulterous queens, accused of betrayal, could be cast down with equal theatricality. Eleanor of Aquitaine, though not executed, was imprisoned for years after rebelling against her husband, King Henry II of England. Isabella of France, accused of intrigue and adultery, navigated a perilous web of accusation and survival. In each case, trials of noblewomen were not merely personal. They became reflections of dynastic politics, their bodies and reputations tools in the hands of men seeking power. What made these trials so distinct was that they always reached beyond the individual. To condemn a noble was to shake alliances, redistribute lands, and alter the balance of kingdoms. To pardon one was to build loyalty, to forge peace, or to strengthen legitimacy. The courtroom became an arena where kings, lords, and clerics wrestled for dominance, with the accused noble standing as both pawn and symbol. In the end, noble trials were less about guilt than about theater, grand performances staged to uphold authority. They remind us that in the Middle Ages, law was not an impartial shield, but a weapon wielded by those who ruled. For the common folk, watching a noble stripped of dignity or sent to the gallows was both shocking and reassuring. It showed that even the mighty could fall, though in truth, it was rarely justice that decided their fate, but the ruthless dance of power. When honor was stained, and words could not resolve it, medieval courts sometimes turned to the most primal of verdicts: combat. Trial by combat, also known as judicial duel, was a practice rooted in the belief that God would grant victory to the just cause. To medieval eyes, it was not simply violence, but divine arbitration, a holy clash where steel and strength revealed truth. For the men and women who witnessed it, trial by combat was law, faith, and spectacle woven into one. The origins of this practice reached back to the early Germanic tribes, where disputes between warriors were often settled by the sword. By the 12th century, it had become codified in parts of Europe, especially in France, Germany, and England. If two parties could not agree, or if evidence was insufficient, they might petition for trial by combat. The court would grant the duel, designating the field, summoning spectators, and blessing the fight in God's name. The combatants were not always knights. Sometimes commoners, merchants, or even women were called to fight, or to appoint champions to fight in their stead. Chroniclers record strange cases. A woman accused a man of murdering her husband, and when trial by combat was granted, she fought with a stone wrapped in cloth while the man wielded a club. Other times, aged nobles or frail plaintiffs hired strong champions to take their place, turning justice into a contest of mercenaries. The duels themselves were elaborate rituals. A sacred oath was sworn before combat, each fighter declaring their cause just and placing their fate in God's hands. The field was consecrated, weapons chosen according to law, swords, maces, or clubs depending on rank and station. In some regions, even armor was regulated, ensuring the fight was not only fair, but symbolic. The fight began under the eyes of lords, clerics, and crowds, every blow carrying not only physical danger, but moral weight. Victory was decisive. The defeated, if not killed outright, was declared guilty and often executed on the spot. Sometimes they were hanged, sometimes mutilated, sometimes humiliated before death. To lose was to be condemned by God himself. Yet to win was not always proof of innocence. Some victors were later suspected of trickery, bribery, or even sorcery. The duel could resolve disputes in law, but it could not silence doubts in conscience. One of the most famous medieval trials by combat was that of Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris in 1386, France. Carouge accused Legris of raping his wife, Marguerite. With no witnesses and conflicting testimony, the court allowed a duel. On a cold December day, before King Charles VI and a vast crowd, the two knights clashed in a brutal fight. Carouges killed Legris, and Marguerite's accusation was vindicated. But had Carouges lost, she would have been executed for false testimony. For medieval society, this was justice, God's hand guiding the blade to truth. For us, it was terror disguised as law. Trial by combat also reflected the culture of honor that permeated the Middle Ages. Nobles valued reputation as fiercely as life, and duels allowed them to defend their names with steel. To refuse combat was to accept shame, to be branded a coward or liar. Even when courts no longer favored duels, the idea lingered, shaping the rise of later practices like the gentleman's duel with pistols in the early modern era. By the late Middle Ages, skepticism grew. The Church frowned on trial by combat, preferring testimony and evidence. Kings, seeking greater control of justice, curtailed duels, though they never vanished entirely. In England, the last recorded legal trial by combat took place as late as 1446, and the tradition lingered in law books for centuries afterward. To us, the idea of settling truth with sword and shield seems barbaric, but to medieval minds, it was sacred. Trial by combat was not random violence. It was God's judgment made visible. It was a courtroom where the verdict was written in blood, where the clash of steel echoed louder than any argument, and where the victor walked away not only with life, but with righteousness. Not every medieval court case ended in fire, blood, or high politics. Some descended into farce, scenes so absurd that they read more like satire than solemn law. Yet these cases, comic though they may seem to us, were deeply serious to those who lived them. They reveal not only the strangeness of medieval justice, but also its creativity, its theatricality, and its reliance on public shaming as a tool of order. Take, for instance, the crime of theft. A peasant caught stealing bread or ale might not face death, but instead endure punishments designed to humiliate. One man in Germany, convicted of stealing wine, was paraded through town strapped to a cask, forced to confess his thirst to every neighbor he passed. Another, accused of cheating customers at the market, was fastened to a post with the very goods he had sold. Spoiled fish tied around his neck until the stench did as much punishment as the sentence. Medieval courts also had a fondness for the pillory and the stocks, where offenders were locked in wooden frames in public squares. There they became objects of ridicule, pelted with mud, dung, rotten vegetables, or worse. In England, a baker who sold bread too light in weight might be chained to his faulty loaves. In France, butchers who sold rancid meat were sometimes forced to eat it before jeering crowds. These punishments had a theatrical quality, turning justice into comedy, at least for the onlookers. There were also strange, symbolic sentences. In one village, a man who insulted a priest was ordered to crawl on his knees through the streets, holding a candle as penance. In another, a woman accused of gossip was made to wear a heavy iron bridle, called a scold's bridle, that clamped her tongue, forcing silence while bells on the contraption drew attention to her shame. Though cruel, these punishments were meant to correct behavior through spectacle, blending humor with humiliation. Even animals, as we saw earlier, could be subject to absurd proceedings. In some cases, entire communities of vermin were solemnly excommunicated. Imagine the scene: a bishop addressing a swarm of caterpillars, threatening them with curses unless they departed the vineyards. To us, this borders on comedy. To medieval villagers, it was both earnest and reassuring, a way to impose order on nature's chaos. Some punishments bordered on carnival. Drunkards might be dunked in rivers or paraded around in wheelbarrows. A man caught lying in court could be forced to wear a paper crown inscribed with the word perjurer. In Italian towns, dishonest merchants were sometimes marched backwards through the marketplace, their shame displayed with every awkward step. Each act turned the courtroom into a stage where the community laughed at the offender's downfall, even as it absorbed the moral lesson. Yet laughter was not always innocent. Behind the comedy often lurked cruelty. The stocks left people exposed to the elements, sometimes for days. Scolds' bridles cut tongues and drew blood. Forced feedings of spoiled food could sicken or kill. What seemed like a comic punishment to the crowd was often torment for the condemned. Humor and horror were interwoven, inseparable threads in the fabric of medieval justice. Still, these absurd cases remind us that medieval law was not only about fear and death, but also about performance. The court was a place where society's values were reinforced through spectacle, sometimes terrifying, sometimes ridiculous. To humiliate a liar, to parade a thief, to silence a gossip. These were not merely punishments, but rituals of community, played out in front of watchful neighbors. To modern readers, the absurdity can provoke laughter. But for those who endured it, the comedy of the courtroom could be the cruelest kind of tragedy. These punishments reduced people to objects of ridicule, turning their pain into entertainment, their humiliation into a public feast of scorn. And in that laughter lay the power of medieval justice, not only to punish, but to remind everyone watching that order, honor, and obedience must never be broken. As the last echoes of gongs and church bells faded over medieval marketplaces, the trials of the Middle Ages left behind not just punishment and spectacle, but a legacy that would shape the centuries to come. To modern minds, these court cases, whether ordeals by fire, the trial of animals, or the grotesque cadaver synod, seem more like grim fairy tales than real law. Yet they were no fantasy. They were the heartbeat of medieval justice, reflecting a world where faith, fear, and authority were inseparable. And though the rituals themselves have vanished, their influence lingers in surprising ways. At their core, medieval trials remind us of the power of spectacle in law. Justice was not a hidden transaction, but a public performance. A thief in the stocks, a pig on trial, a duel fought before a king. Each event was staged for the eyes of the community. Law was not only about punishing the guilty, but about teaching the living. Even today, traces of this theatrical impulse survive. The drama of modern trials broadcast on television, the symbolic weight of a judge's robe, or a jury's solemn verdict. The stage has changed, but the instinct remains the same. These trials also reveal the deep entanglement of religion and justice. The ordeal, the witch trial, the excommunication of vermin, all were grounded in the belief that divine will spoke through human institutions. To medieval people, crime was not only social disorder but cosmic disruption, requiring God's judgment to set right. Over time, as science and secular law advanced, the Church retreated from such practices. Yet the echoes endure in the moral weight that still clings to law, in the oaths sworn on holy books, in the language of justice that often invokes higher ideals. Another legacy lies in the gradual shift from superstition to reason. The decline of ordeals after the 13th century marked a turning point. as evidence, testimony, and procedure began to replace ritual tests. The absurdities of animal trials and corpse condemnations faded, mocked by humanist thinkers as relics of ignorance. Slowly, law became less about fear and spectacle, more about rational inquiry. The transition was uneven and incomplete, but it laid the groundwork for the systems of justice we know today. The great trials of the Middle Ages also left behind unforgettable stories. Joan of Arc, whose death turned injustice into sainthood. Jean de Carouge, whose duel for his wife's honor inspired legend. The Cadaver Synod, still whispered as a symbol of papal corruption. These cases shaped not only legal history, but cultural memory, becoming cautionary tales, moral lessons, and sources of fascination for generations. They remind us that law is never only about rules. It is about people, power, and the narratives we weave around them. And then there is the darker legacy, the reminder of how easily justice can be twisted by fear. Witchcraft trials stand as grim warnings of what happens when superstition, paranoia, and politics converge. Animal trials show how desperate humans can be to impose order on chaos. The laughter at absurd punishments reminds us of how cruelty can hide in humor. These cases warn us that law, left unchecked, can become a tool not of fairness, but of vengeance, mockery, and oppression. Yet for all their strangeness, medieval trials were deeply human. They reveal a society grappling with the same questions we still face. How do we know the truth? How do we punish the guilty? How do we maintain order in a chaotic world? Their answers seem alien to us now, but they were born of the fears and beliefs of their time. In that sense, the medieval courtroom was not so different from our own. A place where society projects its values, its terrors, and its hopes. Today, when we read of pigs in court or corpses on trial, we may laugh or recoil, but we should also listen. These stories tell us that justice is always a mirror of its age, sometimes cruel, sometimes absurd, always revealing. The Middle Ages may be gone, but the questions remain, echoing like a judge's gavel across the centuries.